Once I was in the Spirit, and there before me was a throne in heaven. And the one who sat there had the appearance of jasper and carnelian. A rainbow resembling an emerald encircled the throne.
Well, welcome. Here we are on episode 3 of The Holy City is for Everything. A little different setup this morning, but we're ready to dive in. Are you ready to dive in, honey?
I am ready to dive in. You did say the Holy City is for everything.
Did I? Interesting Freudian slip. The Holy City is for everyone, all people. We could say the Holy City is for all beings, all things as well. But it's definitely a story written by and for people in this world. As we begin to dive in, and we're going to dive in, the waters are going to get murkier today. They're going to get pretty riled up. We're really getting into the story. And I guess as I was preparing to come, I was thinking a little bit about, again, just sort of the question of, why are we doing this? You know, there's so many things to give your attention to in the world. I was just checking in with the news and thinking about this flotilla heading to Gaza to bring aid to the people there, and just all of the incredible need. And you and I are sitting here reading Revelation. And I think there is something about our choice to do this, and we're going to get into that, I think, in our conversation today around all that is needed on this earth, all that is needed in this world, all that is needed to really make this God's world, to really make this a place where we really do live out this call to be loving with one another, and how far we stray. So we're going to get into some difficult scenes and some violent imagery, and I think we're going to find that there's reasons it's so tumultuous, because this new world we are longing for is going to require some significant change. That's my intro today to our next journey into the book of Revelation and our exploration of chapters 4 through 7 to the first line of chapter 8. So where might you like to dive in as we step into these tumultuous images? Ted, what do you want to start with?
I think it's helpful to be grounded in the narrative, because there are actually a lot of points which we can anchor ourselves upon as we're in that evocative image, wading in these waters, swimming in these waters, being tossed about in these waters. And there's the promise at the end of the book that the waters will be no more, which is a complicated image, because if there was no water on earth, there'd be no life, but it's just not exactly what that's about, right? And that's kind of one of the tensions that we're learning how to sort through: the world that we live in, the life that we experience day by day, and this deeper inner reality, which has spiritual aspects and truths to it, that as we encounter them, they can change us, they can transform us, they can also profoundly confuse us and lead us astray. And so we're with John on this confusing journey, and he, having had that initial experience that we talked about last week, which gave him clarity to receive wisdom and teachings from the Spirit, from Christ, for these churches that were real churches, real communities, and real cities in Asia Minor. Now he's going even deeper, or higher, if you like, into the spiritual realm, and we catch that right away. He says, I'm now in a trance. So he's already been in a trance, having those initial experiences, and now he's going yet further in. That's an important clue for us, right? That now something has shifted, and his whole perspective, what he's aware of, is now profoundly expanded. And that picks up with the kind of fantastical imagery that's going to start to manifest. And we're only getting started, looking ahead, right? We have a show hence, not next one, but the one after that. Then, one might say all hell will break loose, almost literally, and the imagery will go, cinematic from our 21st century experience. But here, John is continuing to have these inner experiences, which are leading to visions that he's then struggling to understand. And yet he's able to be clear-minded enough to hear and to see, and then to relate to us what it is that he's heard and he's seen. And so what I want us to especially remember about that is that this doesn't negate the first part of the book. It doesn't change life for these 7 cities that he's written these letters to. It doesn't change his life in exile on Patmos. But now he's understanding things on another higher level that encompasses that and shows him even more. So those anchor points, his everyday life, his everyday communities, they're not lost, they're not gone, they're not being dismissed. But now we're seeing the things that he was talking about there in a new profound way. So Christ shows up in those first images, those first letters. Christ is showing up again, and now in a new way. And we can understand even more profoundly the power and importance of Christ in relationship to the spiritual and the divine that John is now aware of on a higher level.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. And that first representation of Christ in this next phase, as he's heading up to this higher level, he also speaks about seeing a door standing open. So he's stepping through a new doorway, and now he sees Christ on the throne. And I would definitely gave a lot of attention to that image of the throne. In my Swedenborgian tradition, and probably in many, the throne is sort of the symbol of judgment. The one who sits on the throne is the judge, and Judgment Day, the last judgment, is such a theme in our Christian understanding of what's happening. And
in this book.
And in this book, that's what this is about. And for those reading this literally, there's this idea of the last judgment is going to separate the people and cause all of this physical turmoil. And what really crystallized for me in reading this is that the last judgment is about that moment in our maturing process, which is a theme, where we really get that we have the freedom to choose. We have the freedom to choose whether we're going to give our attention to God, to the holy, to love, to life, or whether we're going to continue to give our attention to the ethos of the material plane, to our survival, to competition, to materialism. That's the judgment that is being made manifest by the image of the throne from my reading and my perspective. And the one sitting on the throne is Christ, the Lamb. So it's this, we think of the judge as the king, the authority, the powerful, and yet we, as we so often do in Scripture, we have that flipped on its head, where the one doing the judging is actually the one who is slain, the one who is innocent, the one who is pure, the one who is not power hungry, and is instead this servant to all. So actually the judging forces in these whole chapters is that judgment of innocence, and how somehow love can feel painful and innocence can feel painful or hurtful if we ourselves are not in a place of innocence and love.
Yeah, the Lamb entering into the throne. It's not described as a throne room, but we can use that phrase because it's helpful. This incredible display of power and glory, with evocative images from Hebrew scriptures of the rainbow and divine angels and beings. The tension of the Lamb's appearance, of Christ's appearance into that, is that the one in the throne has something to give, has something that could be opened to reveal even more of the divine presence and divine truth, and no one can open it, right? And John, hearing that, and it's dramatically displayed, John notices the scroll, an angel calls out, "Who's worthy?" No one answers, no one responds, no one is worthy. And John weeps, right? Because he wants that so much. He's drawn to and loves the divine presence and wants this furthering opening of the divine truth and wisdom, and he can't have it. It's the definite resonance for me of the emotional experience of being a Mets fan, right? You may want the championship, but we weep, right? Because no one can open it up for us, except on the rare occasions that someone comes forward.
Right. Well, and I think of the disciples who love Jesus and want to follow him, and were so often just had no idea what he was talking about.
Mm-hmm.
We're so often off the mark. There's that theme throughout Scripture of not being given, that there's more to know about this Scripture. There's more to know about this story, but we can only receive what we're ready for. And that sort of comes to a head in this presentation of the scroll.
And then the contrast of what is it that can open this, that can break these seals and open the scroll. What is it, right? It's the Lamb who comes forward. An angel declares, excuse me, one of the elders, right? So there's the scene, right? We have the throne with the glorious one on the throne. And then around the throne are these four living creatures who have eyes to see in and out, and have four faces that come in, so they're aware in all directions. And then between the four are 24 elders, presumably groups of 6, who are facing the throne. So it's one of the elders who says to John, "Don't weep, look, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the Root of David, has emerged victorious, so that he can open the scroll and its 7 seals." And what does that mean? It means that the Lamb, not the lion, but the lamb, the wonderful way Scripture plays with images of power and innocence and love and sacrifice and courage. It's the lamb who was slain. And it seems to me that this becomes so important, that what the lamb that was slain means is Jesus in his earthly ministry, practicing his servant leadership, right? His putting others before himself, his coming as a heavenly being who came down to be in the earthly realm with ordinary flesh and blood human beings to bring us love, forgiveness, and hope. Not the propitiatory atonement, not that he was willfully sacrificed by God to overcome some sin or debt or stain that needed to be. That's not what's happening here. That's not the power that gives Jesus the capacity to open the scroll. It's the power of being for others. And if you think about it, God as the creator is a being for others. Right?
Mm-hmm.
We often say God is so awesome and we should all praise and worship God. God, in God's power, gives God's own being away to bring other conscious beings into existence that they might have loving relationship with God and one another.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
That should sound familiar to our listeners if they're at all familiar with the Great Commandment. Right? That's the principle we're working with here. Right? It's not God's arbitrary judgment and anger and punishment. That's not it. It's God's nature manifesting and transforming and revealing. And that's what God did in Jesus. That's why Jesus is a seminal figure for so many of us in humanity of worship and love and divine wisdom. It's the divine, generous, life-giving, powerful nature manifesting and transforming us. That's what opens this scroll and makes it possible for us to go deeper into the wisdom and mystery of God.
Yes. Yeah. That attitude of, which is so powerful, because we can only learn things, we can only receive new wisdom if we are innocent, if we're open, if we have a confidence that we're a part of something bigger, and it's not just about accumulating for me, but having that perspective of unity is what makes possible deeper wisdom. And it's a stage. We had one of our collaborators, Dory, who's leading a podcast, right, or a discussion group about Revelation at St. John's. She brought in the question of, what about people who are not mature and who are reading this, or children, and I think that really, this is the last book in the Bible. And I was actually reminded of the book of Daniel, where he talks about, at the end of the book of Daniel, kind of that the book has been closed up, but you, Daniel, close up and seal the words of the scroll until the time of the end. There are these themes of, there's a lot here, there's a lot of wisdom here, but we're not ready to go deep until we're ready to go deep. We're not ready to go into it we're not ready to go into it until, as you said, we have that connection to innocence, until we are able to live in the world as Jesus showed us and as Jesus did for others. And so there's a maturation that has to happen before we can really dive more deeply into self-understanding and into this journey of transformation. And probably we have to go deeper until we can really make such a choice as to believe that we can choose heaven, we can choose God. There are stages of our evolution probably where we're not even aware that we have that choice. We're not even aware that we have that responsibility and that freedom to choose. So I don't have the full answer of what you do when a 6-year-old picks up Revelation and how you read it to them, because obviously it's available, but it is pointing to a story that we're not ready to engage it until we're ready to engage it, I guess. In my tradition, in the Swedenborgian tradition, Daniel Swedenborg really said that preparedness, that readiness actually started in his time around 1700, that we are starting to be more conscious, more aware, more more knowledgeable that we, coexist on this planet with a lot of other people who have different perspectives than us, and that we are actually sort of ready to really engage this stuff on a deeper level as a species because of our evolution and the growth of our minds and hearts. I know sometimes it doesn't feel like we're growing when we look out at what's going on the planet. It feels like sometimes it can feel like a regression. It does. It's part of my tradition to believe that actually we are growing, we are maturing, and we're growing to the point where there's really a need for us to start to take deeper responsibility for our own choices, for our own inner development, and to really take this call seriously, to give our attention to the Holy One, to follow the path of Christ, to live for others, as you said, to begin to manifest those divine qualities in our day-to-day, week-to-week lives.
We've talked about maturity and immaturity in previous weeks. Dory's question kind of embodies that in the most profound and immediate way, right? Physically immature, emotionally and intellectually immature human beings, right? The children in their journey of growing. I think part of the answer is you don't read this book to a child, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's a straightforward answer. And I think it's a potent one, right? I have multiple children's Bibles that I've cracked open over the last few years, and generally Revelation is not part of it, right? The idea of Jesus's return is a part of it. The idea of God's abiding love for us that can overcome all things. Those things are important for a 6-year-old to hear, especially in tumultuous times. But when the New Testament was being put together, Revelation wasn't put first. It was put last, right? It's the last thing you read. Yeah. And the other things prepare you to read it. That's part of the idea here.
Yeah.
So, and there was tremendous debate in the early church about whether it should be included or not. And there was debate in the Reformation about whether it should be included or not again. So, and I'm glad it is. And there are reasons why I would understand those who thought it should not be. But John, it seems to me, is a pretty spiritually mature person, able to have these experiences and relate them, although he has his foibles, and we'll kind of get to that the further we go along into the imagery that starts to come out of his experience. And I think it's important and helpful to remember that he was living in a very tumultuous time. And I haven't talked about this up to this point, but you could make the argument, you could make the historical argument, that the time in which John was writing, end of the 1st century CE, was one of the most culturally complex and internationally interconnected times ahead of the time we live in now, right? It might be the second high point for a kind of international culture. And that was forged out of conquest and war, right? It was forged out of Alexander the Great, conquering the known world through to the Indus Valley, and behind him, Greeks building cities everywhere that they went, and then making that language the language that everyone spoke, so that suddenly there was a way to communicate across peoples and cultures, imposed, but nevertheless a way to connect. And then through various and sundry ebbs and flows of history and war and conquest, the Romans come and put a military dictatorship, for lack of a better word, on top of all of it, and maintained it for centuries. And people traveled. Paul is not an isolated figure in the New Testament traveling all over the Mediterranean world. People traveled, and there were international bodies. And in the midst of that was this, for a lot of people, this incredible sense of displacement and uncertainty. Weren't sure who they were anymore. They weren't sure that their ancestors and their language mattered anymore. And there was so much fear and disquiet and uncertainty. A lot like our time, a lot like our time. Although now I think part of and this is why I feel hopeful about our time, there is this renewed effort to recognize the diversity of voices, to not have everyone speaking Greek and following Roman law, but to have people recognize in a common shared framework, what's your tradition? What's your story? What's your history? What's your people? And that's calling us to a sense of justice and the profound, harmful, horrific things that have unfolded in history that we need to acknowledge and seek forgiveness for and restoration for and restitution for. And that goes along lines of race. It goes along lines of gender. It goes along lines of sexual orientation. There's so many things that we need to recognize, patterns of abuse, of oppression that we can let go of and learn from one another in a completely different stance where we're all recognized as equals, all beloved children of God, all with a unique perspective to share, which when we share it enriches the understanding of every single one of us. We could go in that direction. We have the possibility of it. I don't think that was a possibility in the end of the Hellenistic age, that period of history. Rome had to collapse.
Right.
Hopefully, our society doesn't have to completely collapse to happen now.
Right.
Although some things have to go.
Yeah. Well, and how do we, let's get into that story, because that's very much the story that we're getting into in these 5 chapters. So we have the scroll on the throne. There's this despair that it can't be opened, but then we get the promise that the Lamb can open it, and we start to move through the opening of the 7 seals. And each time one is opened, we hear stories of the unleashing of different figures that really represent in many ways what you just described, kind of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, those first 4 seals. Let's dig into them. They obviously have a lot of standing. Most people on the planet have probably heard of the four horsemen of the apocalypse. Reading a bit and thinking a bit about the 4 horsemen as each of them representing kind of stages of our human evolution. The first horse being the child, the second horse being the youth, the third horse being the adult, and then the 4th horse, of course, is death. These stages of what it is to live on the planet. And the first horse is the he's going to conquer, which you think of the child coming out with that conqueror spirit. I'm going to be who I am. I'm going to conquer and make my way. The second horse is out to kill, and in our youth, sometimes there is this impetus in us to, not only am I going to conquer, but I'm going to be myself, and I'm going to be different from you. I'm going to destroy you. I'm going to let my way and my will stand in the world. And I find the third horse of adulthood so resonant. This idea of the black horse is measuring, probably because I'm coming out of a phase of measuring. I can just so identify with that way of being in the world, of just measuring everything. How am I going to, judging everything, trying to manage everything, that sometimes we see adulthood as this stage of needing to do that to survive, right? We have to measure, make judgments, figure out how to manage this material world. And then that 4th horse is death. And so then we manage, and then eventually we go, what is all this managing about? What am I managing my life for? What am I measuring everything for? Because I'm going to die. Eventually I'm going to die. All this getting my house in order and measuring everything to know what's right and what's wrong. What does that even mean in the face of death? What is that endeavor even about in the face of death? So those 4 horses, to me, they really do kind of paint the picture of so much of our humanness, our desire to kind of take control of this life that we're living. And it's powerful and also destructive. And hearing the story of the way in which that time, the John's time wasn't so dissimilar to ours, and some of the unity that occurred because of conquering, because of, it's a real mixed bag. You sort of can see the usefulness of what we also could perceive as incredibly violent and destructive. So I don't know, for me, the 4 horsemen are sort of like, it's just what is, it's just what happens. It's just what human beings, it's part of this journey of being alive. We're going to go through these stages and we're going to have these experiences. And in this journey, in this inner moment, we're having the opportunity to observe and reflect upon them instead of just being in them and thinking that's all that's ever going on. What's your take on the 4 horsemen?
I think that's a really good read. And to view them as these kind of, if you were to use Jungian language, these kind of archetypal forces that describe human energy that manifests across history, across lives, across individuals, and expresses in our experience of this world how chaotic our life is, and our attempts to control it will come to nothing, right? It will come to the chaos of death and all the forms of death, ways that we die. It's, I think, really helpful to note that the Lamb opens a seal, and one of the 4 living creatures, living beings, calls out, "Come," and the horseman comes. And what I hear in that, and what I see in that is this interplay between the earthly and the spiritual, or the earthly and the heavenly. I prefer spiritual because heavenly has so many other connotations to it. Here's this divine energy centered on the throne, organized in these elders and in these living creatures. And when that opens up, the earthly realm, this is what manifests. This is what it manifests initially. Remembering that we're on this iterative journey, right? The first thing we got were the letters, 7 of them. Now we're getting 7 seals on a single scroll that's going to open up mysteries of the earth and heaven to us, the mysteries of God to us, earth and the spiritual to us, earthly and the spiritual to us. And so the initial openings are these forces that need to be tempered, right? They need some kind of spiritual infusion to give them their full possibility. And we're living in almost conflict now between the earthly and the heavenly, the earthly and the spiritual. And we want to arrive at a place of harmony. That's where we're going to arrive at. It's going to be a long, it'll be a long, twisting, and bloody road, quite literally in the text, although remembering the text is figurative, or at least symbolic. And here we are. We've seen the world in the letters kind of as it is. Now we're seeing it from a higher spiritual perspective, and we're seeing this tension, ways in which the earthly does not reflect the spiritual. And you raised that question for us at the beginning. John was also asking that question. How could the God of Christ, the creator of heaven and earth, and the one who manifested in this world God's love and power and compassion and rose from the dead, how could this world be the one that we're in? Ruled over by these ruthless Romans, wealth and power, just corrupting people everywhere. And I'm here in exile. How can this be? That's what he's wrestling with. And this is the answer to his wrestling. This vision, this ongoing vision is the answer, the response to his wrestling. And right now, here are these forces that are coming out that they're not really godly.
Yeah. Yeah.
They're spiritual, but in a earthly kind of way to manifest earthly power and passion. And that's corrupting. That's going to lead to death.
Yeah. And yet they're sort of unavoidable. That's part of seeing them coming from this heavenly realm and being bidden out by the 4 living creatures. There is a humbling of like, this is what it is to be alive. We have the ability to kill one another. We have the freedom to do that. I feel humbled by the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. I feel because to just recognize this is part of what it is to be a human being. And as part of this creation that God has given us is the freedom to love one another or to kill one another, the freedom to judge one another or to be in freedom. And that these freedoms that we've been given are tempting. I mean, they must be. I mean, a lot of people are choosing them. A lot of have and continue to choose to kill and to conquer and to measure and to judge. That all of that whole impetus is very much alive in the human species. And we can't just wish that away. And I think that's actually it's really useful to kind of acknowledge that. I like the image of the horseman because a horse has a rider, and it needs to be, reined in. That there's a relationship between the rider and the horse, and that's a kind of, when you describe these 4 horsemen as energy, it's like to realize these are energies that are in us, and how are we reining them in? How are we riding them? How are we navigating them? Because to just ignore them or imagine that they're not in play is probably not going to give us the outcome that we're looking for. The transformation requires that we wrestle with these energies.
Because they're coming from these essential creatures around the throne. There's a divine calling that reveals a human response. And what we're trying to get to is the place where that response is spiritually wholesome.
Right.
And nurtures harmony, that it grows the divine desire, power, and presence in our lives, rather than aggrandizing us and our power, our wants, our individual or even communal strivings.
Well, and that's something we think a lot about in our Swedenborgian understanding, is that and all of this is playing out in all of us. And when I can think about the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse as energies that exist in me, a desire, they can become useful forces, to conquer my inner landscape so that I might be focused in the direction I want to go, or to kill that which is ready to go, those things that maybe I'm holding on to that are not taking me in the direction I want to be. and to measure my life, to have judgment, internal judgment about how I want to live and what's true. I think that continues to be the most useful way to read this, is if I can just turn it back around onto my journey and what's going on for me, instead of projecting it out onto the rest of the planet. Then some of those forces can become useful for my own process of integration and growth. Do you have more to say about them, or should we go on to the fifth seal?
I think we can keep going.
Okay. So what about this fifth seal? I definitely have some thoughts. After these 4 horsemen, now we hear about these people who died for their faith, right? When he opened the 5th seal, I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slain because of the word of God and the testimony they had maintained. So after we wrestle with these 4 primal, potentially destructive powers, after these first 4 seals, something opens up that's quite beautiful. Those who had been killed, so those who have died, parts of ourselves perhaps that have died because of their faithfulness and this world just wasn't ready for them. Now they reappear and they enter the picture, and they're given a white robe. So they sort of, I don't know, there's sort of a tenderness, I feel like, with the 5th seal. And honestly, I think of the 5th day of creation, the beginning of the creatures upon the earth. There's like this beginning of life, this like beginning of the emergence of new life, which is so vital in this journey of growth that we're on. What does the 5th seal bring out for you?
We were talking about the tension of John's experience of the world and his faith and his understanding of who God is and who Christ is, and asking, how can this be? Here it is, right? Mm-hmm. Here it is manifest in the text. Mm-hmm. And the thought that came to me, and I was wondering, should I share it? And I'm going to. I think it might be helpful to draw a contrast between what we're reading here in Revelation, in this apocalyptic text, this Christian apocalyptic text, and a Gnostic text, which would take the same question and provide a radically different answer. I'm not going to name a Gnostic text in particular. I know about it. I am in no way an expert on it. But a general impetus of Gnostic first century texts is that the material world is actually illusory, right? Their answer to the problem of suffering, or what's sometimes called theodicy, why is there evil in the world? If God created everything as all powerful and good, then why is there evil? Their answer is it only appears to be, right? None of this matters, right? That in the spiritual realm, all is good. And we're in a kind of illusion here. And the material world's to be sloughed off in the end, right? It's not to be honored or kept. It has no spiritual value. That's not a Christian approach to understanding the world, our life, and God, right? We see creation is good. Our bodies are good. Get cranky and old and die, right? And I experience that more every day as I get close to 57. But they're good. And so that raises the question then, how did we get here, right? And the answer in a lot of ways of Revelation is, well, we're here, so don't worry about that question. Worry about where we're going, right? And hope in what God is going to do next. And the end of Revelation, it's a new heaven and a new earth. It's a recreation. That which became lost and corrupted becomes renewed and refined. So here we have, with the unsealing of the 5th seal, all of the faithful people, and here in John's time, right, we're thinking prophets, right? We're thinking Old Testament prophets. We're thinking maybe he has a broad vision, right? Anyone in the world who is striving for justice, for compassion, for mercy, for truth. These people who died for that commitment, and I'm thinking of the Beatitudes, right? Those who, for righteousness' sake, suffered. That's these people. They're precious to God, and they're close to God, but they're under the altar, right? They're not part of the wider circle. They're under it. And here I wonder, is there a perspective thing, right? When we're caught in woe is me, or why did this happen? Or God, when are you going to get back at those who did this to me? We're actually under, right? We've put something between us and a direct experience of God. And God, in Christ in particular, right, invites us to forgive and to move beyond and to see ourselves as working God's purposes in the world by striving for the good. I think we'll see that very shortly in the text. What happens if you take that on as how you view your life? You're in a different place. You're not actually under the altar. You're a part of it.
All right, I'm having a bit of a coughing fit here. My delightful husband has brought me a cough drop. Hopefully I'll do better from here on out. Sixth seal. Now things are really picking up. So the sixth seal, and interestingly, I do feel a real connection between the sixth seal, the sixth day of creation, when humankind and the animals come into being. There's a big fullness of life. I'm thinking also about the sixth angel that we heard earlier in the story, the angel and the sixth church, which was the Church of Philadelphia, which was the one that gets kind of the highest praise. This is the church that's sort of doing the best in terms of their ministry and their work. So there's sort of a fullness about this sixth day, a sense of completion. And in this iteration, this is when the earthquake comes. This is when destruction emerges. And I can't help but think about, in my tradition, we talk about vastation, which is sort of a stage of our spiritual evolution, where everything that we thought we were is stripped away, and that very, very resonant with the vision of spiritual rebirth. To be reborn in the spirit is to die to our earthly selves. There is this invitation to death, and that is so kind of, in a very big way, depicted in the opening of the sixth seal and the earthquake. It's not so good, and there's a lot of people who are really suffering in that tumult. People of all stripes, right? There's a description of people who are rich, and the kings and the princes and the mighty and the slaves, many hiding in the rocks. And actually, interestingly, like, that earthquake feels like the destruction, but what it says in the passage is that they're hiding, and they actually want the rocks to fall on them so that they can hide from the face of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. So they're actually not hiding from the destruction. They're hiding from God. They're hiding from the judgment, again, that we sort of talked about it from the beginning, the judgment of God, the judgment of the Lamb, the face of the innocent.
And that means that it's God's nature, God's very character, to them is something to be feared.
Yeah.
And, here's where we can talk about how we get caught up in systems of oppression, internal and external, and their destruction affects everyone and can cause fear for everyone, because that system of oppression is all you've known. And it takes such courage to look at it and say, this isn't right. And that's what the folks who were under the altar were asking, right? They were in situations where it was oppressive, and they stood up and said, this isn't right. And in doing so, they suffered. They suffered death. Here's the flip side of that, right? Here are all the people who didn't have that courage. And it's important, I think, that it starts with the leaders. In my I'm using the Common English Bible. It's the kings of the earth, and their officials and generals, and the rich and the powerful. The ones who benefit from the system of oppression are where this starts. And they're the ones who've set up a system that is so un-Christ-like that they can only fear the Lamb's very presence rather than seek the Lamb.
It's difficult to see the world, many corners of the world, as Christ-like, or many corners of the systems that we've created. I feel like you can see some, and you can see, how humans have invented amazing abilities to, grow more food, or to distribute, or to share. I mean, we have done some pretty amazing things that have benefited all people, and we've done some horrible things, and we've set up systems of identity and nationality and structure that keeps people apart, and that keeps resources, concentrated in certain areas and not available to those who are really in need. It's I think a lot of us sit with that question right now of how can this really be transformed in a doesn't just include a lot of destruction, because it's so out of balance in so many corners of the planet. Maybe, I don't know, we can debate that. Maybe it's better than it was in John's time. Maybe there are some ways in which systems are expressing divine values, but it does feel like the bulk of it's about competition, right? It's about boundaries between one another instead of a spirit of hospitality and care.
And in the midst of that destruction, the text brings us to this what would otherwise, I think, be peculiar, right?
Mm-hmm.
But when you put it in this context, it makes sense now. This vision of 144,000 men, virginal men, and here's, I think, one of John's quirks, I would say, right? How his heart and mind received this, could only receive what he knows and sees. And
Mm-hmm.
it seems to me, as we go through the text, we might have a cause to wonder, what does John really think about sexuality, human
Mm-hmm.
sexuality, and reproduction and all that? This is the first instance where that question comes up for me. So you have 144,000 out of the tribes of Israel
Mm-hmm.
marked with the seal of the Lamb. So these are different human beings than the ones who are asking the rock to fall on them. They're ready to hear the Lamb. They'll show up again later in the text, these 144,000. So we want to highlight that now. It looks like it's all destruction. It looks like no one human is able to receive this message, but there actually are. They're not just under the throne. Also these unique men on the earth, and we'll come to more folks in just a minute.
Yeah.
And I was, the other thing that was, well, we'll save that for actually when they show up again later. You had such an interesting insight about the 144,000.
Well, and when we keep the interpretation, when we come back to that interpretation of this whole story being a play that's incurring in every person and in every soul, I think the 144,000 in me is a reminder that there is a part of me that is receptive, that has this, that is a virginal male, open to receive. I've actually heard people speak of the 144,000 as a frequency. There's all this.
That's what I was trying to say for next time, but that's all right. Share it.
I'll pull it out right now. But yeah, like it's a frequency, it's a vibration, that there's a part of me. There's a part of all of us, I believe, that they're just close to the throne. They can hear the message, that is receiving the wisdom and the truth, that knows it's going to be okay, even if on the outside there's a lot of things that are not okay. And that, to me, is a very important part of this part of the story, and the whole story, is that our egos are not going to like what's going on. Our bank accounts might not like, all these. And I've certainly experienced that, that when we get, so much of life is about dealing with challenges to our ego, our external life. And if we can face those challenges with a sense of faithfulness, they are actually helping us to really discern what really matters. Because yes, maybe we don't, maybe I don't totally agree with the Gnostics that the world means nothing, that the world is important, and we're only here for a time, like each of us, right? So the world is important to participate in for the lifespan that we are given to be amongst on this planet, and to contribute, but to contribute something that has deeper meaning than that the world is important, so I have to make sure to build really big buildings or create a lot of material wealth or something. It's like the world is important because it is a place where we can live out this deeper spiritual life, and where we can go through this process of choosing, right? Of choosing, and of really giving our attention to what really matters, and letting the earthquake take away that which is just dross, and is not essential.
And right here in the text, very next passage, after this I looked, and there was a great crowd that no one could number. They were from every nation, tribe, people, and language. They were standing before the throne and before the Lamb. They wore white robes and held palm branches in their hands. They cried out with a loud voice, "Victory belongs to our God who sits on the throne and to the Lamb." And the angels and the elders all sit down and worship. And one of the elders says to John, "Who are these people? And where did they come from?" And in a very apocalyptic motif, he knows, don't try and answer, right? I said to him, "Sir, you know." He said to me, "These people have come out of the great hardship. They have washed their robes and made them white in the Lamb's blood. This is the reason they are before God's throne. They worship him day and night in his temple, and the one seated on the throne will shelter them. They won't hunger or thirst any more. No sun or scorching heat will beat down on them, because the Lamb who is in the midst of the throne will shepherd them. He will lead them to the springs of life-giving water, and God will wipe every tear from their eyes." So this is one of the jewels of the entire Bible, this passage. And this passage, in this moment of Christian nationalism and white supremacy, is a sword coming out of God's mouth to cut that crap down to size. This is God's vision, right? This is God's vision. The whole human family gathered around, dressed in the Lamb's clothes, loving service to everyone, especially the least among us. Not power mongering, not wealth accumulation, not violent exercise of force in the material plane. Loving service to all people, especially the least, like the Lamb. Our clothing is what we show the world, how we come from our inner self and manifest it out in the world. These people from every tribe and language and nation, so it can't be all that were preached through the gospel, right? Can't be. It has to be people whose hearts were holy and divine, that had Christ love in them, Christ-like love in them, and manifested it. This is just a beautiful vision of what's possible for us, of what God desires for us. And here, this is like a tri-pitch, right? We have the people on earth who are powerful and rich, who are terrified that the great earthquake is now going to make all the power structures that they depended on collapse. There are the 144,000 who can receive the seal of the Lamb in the midst of this earthly tumult. And then this is the rest of humanity
Right.
who get it,
Right.
who understand we're one family in this amazing spiritual adventure. And that if we live our lives in loving service to one another, God will just flow through us like life-giving water for all people.
Mm-hmm.
And that motif, that image, is going to come up again, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's where we're going.
Yeah.
It's why this podcast is named what it is. This is the hope of Revelation. This is it.
Yeah.
And if we take that to heart, we're not afraid anymore.
Yeah.
We're just not.
Yes. Yes. The earthquake, the destruction is not to be feared. It's just part of the transformation. Yeah. And even
Part of the vestation in your
in my
tradition's
language, part of the vestation, exactly. And even those horsemen of the apocalypse, to recognize those impulses. Yes, we're one family and we all have those impulses, the whole family, all the tribes have those impulses. And that's not the end. Here I am on a Revelation podcast, and it's not the end of the world. It's not the end of the world that we have those impulses.
Mm-hmm.
It's part of the design of human life. And it doesn't need to be our destruction because of this innocence that is at the heart and that we can return
We
to.
can choose to put on the robe of the Lamb, right?
Yeah.
We can choose to follow his path and not the path of the
Yes.
horseman.
Yes. And part of what it is to be human is that we have been given that choice. And it culminates, this whole opening of the seals culminates with the seventh seal and just this one sentence, chapter 8, verse 1. When he opened the seventh seal, there was silence in heaven. In my translation, for about a half an hour. What does your translation say?
The same.
The same thing, which is interesting. I should have given a little more time to the significance of a half an hour, but there's silence at the end of this ordeal, which again is, I think, so reflective of the seventh day of creation, which is about rest and all of this beautiful tumult of humanity that we see kind of depicted in this story. All of it is leading us back to silence, back to rest, back to, I'm thinking of Jesus and my yoke is easy and my burden is light. That it's this invitation. Yeah, we can wrestle, we can think it's all about us, and we can create all kinds of intense beauty and intense pain and all of these things that human beings can do. And the ultimate invitation, which so many spiritual traditions are depicting, is it's this invitation back to silence after all of that tumultuous journey.
Around the world, in all the profound spiritual traditions that humanity has nurtured into being, silence is absolutely golden in your prayer practice, in your meditative practice. To strive for silence it's the apex of the journey. And that stance of silence is one of humility, right? You quiet your own ambitions, your own desires, and you listen, right? It's silence, this inner silence is what enables the possibility of listening and then the Spirit manifesting to you, which is what this whole Revelation journey is.
Yeah. And even beyond listening, there's a power in experiencing the silence itself. Mm-hmm. Even if no word, it's, yes, sometimes we'll hear wisdom or we'll receive. That's certainly a part of the process. And I think many people are starting to discover this as we start to kind of step back a bit from our thoughts and our minds, is that we can experience a quiet mind. we can be alive and not judge everything and measure everything and have ideas about everything. And that when we can taste that experience, it's incredibly life-giving. And I think it's very powerful to me. I think right now at this time, there's so many practices and modalities and teachers that are helping people to find that quiet, because simultaneously there's so much anxiety and mental illness and struggle when we just let our minds kind of totally run the show all the time. So yeah, that silence is not only a place to receive insight and God's word, God's voice, but it's also just it's a moment of reconnecting to, I don't know, the beginning of it all, and what's really real. Because all our measurements and all our ideas about what things are just ideas, or they're just our best, is a tree really a tree, or is it a whole system connected to all kinds of, there's so many ways our brains just want to divide everything, and our thoughts divide everything, our words divide things. And so that silence it's an invitation to stop doing that for a minute. And I think it feeds us on a level that is beyond words in terms of bringing a sense of peace, healing. I think healing really can happen in that silence. So that's what happens with the seventh seal. Of course, it's only one line, and then it's going to get loud again. And the seventh seal opens up and really begins a whole other cycle of seven, that we're going to be getting into next time.
So the next motif are the trumpets.
Yeah.
7 trumpets are blown by the 7 angels who stand before God. So we have this 7 motif now recurring, right? The 7 angels to whom the letters were written, now 7 angels who stand before God. They may be different, they may be the same, but there's enough resonance that it's a common motif that we want to pay attention to. And it's going to get messy. So just buckle up and brace yourselves. We're going to start with 8 and read all the way through to the end of chapter 11, which ends at verse 19. And our invitation to you this go around, if you choose to read ahead so that you can then share the conversation from having had your own experience, is to, as you're encountering these really fantastical things, and it's getting started, right? But as you read these fantastical things, where for you is the most energy, right? As you read these things and kind of let them pass through your heart and mind, what is it that evokes the most energy in you? And to pay attention to that and what that might be. And Sage and I will do that and share that when we come together next week as we begin this. And there'll be plenty more to talk about with the trumpets that break the silence of the 7th seal and start a new cycle of 7 to journey further into the mysteries of God.
And maybe, I don't know, I think perhaps when I do this practice, I will try to sit quietly for 30 minutes. We didn't get into the spiritual significance of 30 minutes, but it's not too long to give yourself a little quiet before you dive into the trumpet sounds, which will be coming.
Indeed. Indeed.
After this, I looked, and there before me was a door, standing open in heaven. And the voice I had first heard, sounding like a trumpet, said,